everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who were here for yesterday's talk, welcome back. Um, we will start by welcoming our speaker for today, Professor Harold Varmus. We are extremely happy to have him give a public talk at NCCS today. So I request Dr. Vani to please welcome the guest. I think this is the third time we are welcoming our guests for the benefit of all those who haven't met him before. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Shekhar Mandi to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Jyoti. Friends, it's great to see the hall full once again this morning, and that's for a reason that we have amongst us Professor Harold Varmus, who is kindly agreed to visit us as a part of the C.V. Raman Professorship of the Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore. And at the outset, I would like to thank the Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore for arranging this visit of Professor Varmus to NCCS Pune. I recall that about 5 years ago, he was due to visit Pune. He doesn't recall that, but we do remember that Preeta Rajambaran had come here, and we were trying to figure out whether he could come here. And instead, he chose to go to a more interesting place called Bangladesh, Dhaka, when it was right in a turmoil. But nonetheless, we are very glad that you are here today, Harold. For the students, his career is a very interesting trajectory that many of us have actually understood over the last several years. He started off with a degree in English literature as a young student. So if there are English literature students here, there is a lesson for your life. There's still time to change your career. And eventually, the lure of medicine, by his own admission, took him to medical school, and then eventually, and in the meanwhile, he did another interesting thing. While he was in the medical school, he did apprenticeship in a very god-forsaken place, what you would think of, called Bareilly in Uttar Pradesh. So he spent a few months in Bareilly as a part of his apprenticeship. And yesterday we were trying to catch up with him whether he picked up any Hindi there, because in the 1960s, I don't think a single person in Bareilly would have spoken English probably. So, but then he said that he does not remember that whether he picked up in English or not, but nonetheless he remembers a song which mentions Bareilly, and all of us know what that song is. His serious exposure to science, by his own admission, came when he went to Ira Pastan's lab at NIH as an alternative to joining military during the Vietnam War. And from there, his actually scientific journey in scientific research probably began. I mean, his own admission at the Nobel side. And 2 years later, he moved over to University of California, San Francisco, and that's where most of the seminal discoveries by his group, in collaboration with Michael Bishop's group, actually happened. They were the first ones to discover the C-SARC genes, as all of us know. They are the genes which are oncogenes and proto-oncogenes. Some of the genes that actually viruses also take with them. And that was one of the very seminal discoveries that literally opened up the field of how cancer is caused by mutations in our own genes and all. But apart from the very intense science that he has carried over decades, he has also been involved in many other aspects. Science administration is one, engagement with society is another, and many other aspects. For example, he was the director of NIH between 1993 and 1998. He was appointed by President Clinton then. And once he finished that, some years later, he also became director of the National Cancer Institute, NCI. It is rather unusual because he had been the director of the entire overarching NIH before, but then later on took up the directorship of NCI. And his directorship actually marked at both the places, NIH and NCI, a significant enhancement in funding the biomedical researchers in US and around the world, which actually is appreciated by many people around the world. He has written a book called The Art and Politics of Science, immensely readable. It takes forward the views that were proposed by C.P. Snow in the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and some of us, those who have read the essay of C.P. Snow, The Tale of Two Cultures, would remember how different disciplines in sciences have diverged significantly. And Harold, in his book, actually argues much more deeper than C.P. Snow did in the 1950s about the different disciplines. He, of course, has received many awards and recognition around the world for his work. The Lasker Prize in 1982, Nobel Prize in 1989 that he shared with Michael Bishop. But one of the things that intrigued me was also he got the Vannevar Bush Award in 2001, which he just now told me that he's extremely proud to have received that. And Vannevar Bush Award is given to people who typically engage with society and do science advocacy and so on and so forth. Vannevar Bush, of course, is known for his very famous essay called Science, the Endless Frontier. Those of you who have read the essay. Currently, he is the Lewis Thomas Professor at Weill Cornell Medicine. He has been a great proponent of open access publishing. In fact, the PLOS movement, he is the founder of the PLOS movement, he and a few others, the Public Library of Science. And apart from science, he also takes interest in other things. He, along with his son, Jacob, they perform what is called as the jeans and the jazz together. So that's Harold and his multifaceted personality. And we're extremely delighted that he agreed to come to NCCS today, and we look forward to your talk, Harold.
Well, I appreciate that very kind and thorough introduction. I'm glad to see all of you here for the last of 6 lectures I've been giving around India under the auspices of the Raman Lectureship. I want and need to thank the Indian Academy of Sciences for their invitation to come in 2020. It took me 3 years to get here because of the pandemic, but very nice to have a chance to do this. Giving these lectures has compelled me to reflect a little bit about what lectures are for, and just very quick survey of the kinds of lectures that I've given in my life. I realize there are basically 4 types of lecture. There's a lecture to students about one's field in the context of a formal course. There are the lectures that we all commonly give to each other about the work that we're doing at the present time. And then there are 2 other kinds of more ceremonial lectures. One that reflects on the body of work that someone has done over the course of many years. And I gave a lecture of that type here yesterday, trying to summarize some of the major things that my laboratory has done, but in the context of describing how discoveries are made, how they're made by conceiving good questions in interesting areas of research, and then interpreting and applying a good result for the benefit of society. But today, we're thinking about a somewhat different kind of ceremonial talk in which we spend some time thinking about how science is done and what it means when science interacts with society. So I'm going to do that by using a kind of artifice. I'm going to tell you about the principles by which I've tried to conduct over 50-some years an exploration of one part of nature, the behavior of certain viruses, and but also how I've tried to think about the scientific enterprise as a whole, with its demographics, its funding, its interactions with government and society, And we're going to do that by reviewing the principles that have been the guiding principles for me in thinking about how to proceed in a tough, competitive, but also exhilarating and gratifying and interesting field of work. So first, let me say a couple of things about what axioms are, at least what people say they are and what I think they are. One dictionary refers to an axiom as being a principle that's generally accepted to be true, but may not be true. But nevertheless, it's a guiding principle by which individuals operate. And what I'm going to give you is a set of 10 of the axioms by which I've conducted my own career. They've worked pretty well for me. They may not work for others, and I don't consider them to be advice. I consider them to be a description of the principles by which I've led my own life. So everyone in this audience is different from me in some ways, and everyone should take these statements of principle as things that you might want to evaluate, but not necessarily embrace. So let me start, first of all, with a principle that has been was important to me in the early stages of my life, and that is not deciding too quickly about what I was going to do, to, in a sense, accept the idea that I was indecisive, was interested in lots of things, as you've heard during the introductory remarks. And I'm going to accompany this axiom by saying that once you make your decision about what you want to do, seize the moment. So I have to give you a few autobiographical facts about myself so you understand the context in which career decisions were made. My parents were the children of immigrants. My grandparents, all four of them, came from parts of Eastern Europe where they were persecuted and arrived in the States in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. None of my four grandparents were professionals or had any long training or educational processes. That none of them had gone to college, but they arrived in the U.S., worked hard, and my parents both went to Ivy League colleges. My mother to Wellesley, my father to Harvard, and they became professionals. My mother was a psychiatric social worker. My father was a family physician, and in that sense, they exhibited the idea that America, at least at that time, was a place where ambitious and hardworking and intelligent people could very rapidly rise in the social structure from the lower classes, indeed poor and lower middle income classes, to the upper middle class professional classes. I went off to a small college, Amherst College in Western Massachusetts, where I entered as a pre-medical student because my father was a doctor, and what does a Jewish boy from New York do when his father's a doctor? He becomes a doctor. That's what was convention at the time. But I was very, very quickly influenced by many other disciplines, philosophy, physics, literature, and ended up writing an undergraduate thesis on Charles Dickens, went off to graduate school in the English department at Harvard to study metaphysical poetry and Anglo-Saxon epics, and then had a second thought and decided that maybe literature was not for me after all, and went back to my original intention of being a medical student, went to Columbia Medical School for 4 years, followed by 2 years of clinical training at the hospital that is affiliated with Columbia University. At that point, though, I had to make another switch because at that time a very unpopular war was being waged by America in Vietnam, and U.S. law required medical school graduates, male medical graduates at least, to do some kind of public service, which was an effort to ensure that our soldiers in Vietnam had adequate medical support. But it was possible to, if you were especially important for those of us who were objectors to the Vietnam War, to have an alternative, and mine was to serve in the public health service and the Public Health Service, then as now, included the National Institutes of Health, where many young men like myself, and here's a cohort of some of them, were able to spend 2 years in government service learning how to do research by working with the esteemed scientists at the National Institutes of Health. This was an important turning point for me because for the first time in my education, I learned to love science and was engaged in an effort to understand how a set of genes in bacteria called the lac operon how these genes were regulated by cyclic AMP, which is known as a mediator of hormonal responses in mammalian cells. So this was a turning point for me because I realized that when presented with really interesting questions about how a small chemical might change the behavior of a cell by altering the transcriptional program of that cell, I found that there was a tremendous opportunity to use new tools of science to understand profound problems that could be useful in understanding, preventing, treating disease. So after a long adolescence, I had a rapid transition at that point to becoming an adult who had chosen a career. And over the course of just a few years, I went from being a member of the Public Health Service at the NIH to a postdoc in the University of California, where I hoped to learn about an approach to understanding cancer that was based on the study of a class of animal viruses called RNA tumor viruses. But once there, very rapidly got involved in research, and within a year was on the faculty. After 2 years, had a tenure track position and began to apply for grants. After 6 years on the faculty, was ready for a sabbatical in London. This was a pretty rapid transition compared to what is very common today, something that worries many of us, that people spend many more years in training than I and many of my colleagues did, that it's hard to obtain a faculty position, it's hard to obtain your first grant, and by the time you're ready for your sabbatical, you may also be ready for retirement. So this is a situation that is a product of a change in the environment, not a change in human nature, and with a lot more people trying to pursue medical research in an environment with shrinking resources, and many people competing for those resources, it is often the case that people feel that they are only independent at a time when they have major family responsibilities and are frankly getting a little old from making the most original kinds of discoveries. So many of my colleagues and I have been writing about how to reduce the competitive atmosphere that's been created in American science and allow people to make a transition to an independent career in their early 30s instead of their early 40s, and to take on risky research subjects without fear that they're going to lose their support. We might talk about that later. But let me turn now to a second axiom that has been a guiding principle from the days in which I began to do research at the NIH and at the University of California. And one of the things that I've always prized, in addition to looking for a situation in which work that I find interesting is going on, is to try to associate myself with people who were smarter than I am. And that began at the very first stage in which I selected Ira Paston, shown here at the left, as my mentor at the NIH. Ira was and still is about 8 years senior to me. We have very similar backgrounds in many ways, but he's a hell of a smart person, and but I was not deterred by his high level of intelligence and critical abilities from joining forces with him at the NIH. David Baltimore, shown in this picture, is probably known to you as a Nobel Laureate for the discoverer of the enzyme reverse transcriptase, who was already at a fairly young age, an iconic example of the intelligence required to work competitively in the field of RNA tumor viruses, and he was, in a sense, an example of the kind of smart person in the field in which I was about to enter. And perhaps most importantly of all, I recognized when I met him in 1969 the remarkable intelligence of Mike Bishop, who became my research partner for over 15 years and is still a close colleague, with whom the similarity in intellectual background was again similar. Again, rather obvious. He too was a graduate of a small college, had studied history in college, and we were drawn together not just by our interest in tumor viruses as a way to study the molecular basis of cancer, but also by our interest in language and writing and those similarities in outlook proved to be very important throughout our relationship. The third axiom is perhaps the most important to anybody's career, and that is the idea of that in choosing a question choosing a topic to work on, one has to be influenced by the nature of a scientific question that you're trying to answer. And my view and in my experience, the critical element in scientific work has been choosing an area to work in that is inherently interesting, that has long-range potential, and that offers up individual questions that are feasible technically at that time. I do think it's important to have a long-range view about the possibility of the findings that one gets during one's research activities to have benefits for society, but that, to my mind, is not the primary motive. The primary motive for choosing something to work on should be the inherent interest of a topic, its feasibility, and its appeal to you. Since I'm telling my story, appealed to me. And at the time that I moved to California to work on RNA tumor viruses, I felt that those viruses containing only a few genes and thought to replicate by an unusual mechanism in which an RNA genome is converted to DNA linked to host chromosomes and then expressed from a provirus inserted in host chromosomes. That seemed to me like a really interesting problem to take on, especially since these viruses were able to induce a wide variety of tumors in chickens, mice, and other experimental animals. And that seemed like an invitation to simplify the problem of identifying genes that might be explicitly involved in carcinogenesis in a time before we had recombinant DNA technology to allow us to identify specific genes with more powerful tools. So that meant that once I chose to move into that field, because I saw a large set of interesting questions, I had to begin to figure out what the questions were going to be. I had learned a fair amount during the courses that were offered at the NIH when I was there as a member of the Public Health Service, and to know that a variety of cancer viruses, both the class that I was interested in, the RNA viruses, and another somewhat heterogeneous class of viruses known as the DNA tumor viruses, were attractive objects of study because they had small genomes, very small collections of viral genes that were able to engineer the transformation of cell behavior from normal to cancerous. But one has to think about questions, both broad questions and narrow questions. And by the time I left the NIH to go to California, I realized there were two big questions I was interested in. One is, how do these viruses that were then called the RNA tumor viruses, we now call them retroviruses, how do they multiply? And that produces a whole set of questions that I described in a little more detail yesterday. Questions about how the RNA genome is copied into DNA, how that DNA is inserted into chromosomes, how the inserted DNA is copied into RNA and the RNA translated into proteins. all these questions seemed interesting and proved to be important because we now know that understanding those steps in the retrovirus life cycle was of fundamental importance in deciding how to treat a dread disease called AIDS, caused by a retrovirus, HIV, that was then unknown when many of us entered the field of RNA tumor virology. The second large question was how do these viruses change a normal cell into a cancer cell? And a community of scientists grew up around this question, recognizing that there were many retroviruses carrying different genes that were responsible for the virus's ability to change cell behavior, and it became possible to, over the long haul, to use those viruses to identify normal cellular genes that we eventually call proto-oncogenes, from which the viral cancer genes had been derived. And today we have many targeted therapies for many different cancers. These are not cures, but they are very useful drugs that inhibit the activity of proto-oncogenes, showing once again that pursuing an interesting question that didn't have immediate clinical application at a very early stage proved to be essential for making a tremendous set of advances that now have benefit for society. So I was not alone in making choices to work in these exciting areas, and many of us who were laboring in the field of retrovirology, even long before AIDS appeared as a disease in the early 1980s, allowed us to learn some pretty important lessons in the 1970s. Our own work tended to be focused on a virus of chickens that had been isolated in 1910, long ago, but virus was not amenable to study until more technologies were developed over the succeeding years, so that by the time I got on the scene, there were methods that allowed more analytic work through the genetics of the virus, molecular biology of the virus, and details I don't have time to talk about. But some key things were learned. The virus carries a cancer gene, in the case of Rous sarcoma virus, the viral Sarc gene, that encodes an enzyme now called a protein tyrosine kinase that adds phosphate to tyrosine and proteins, a novel set of enzymes. And the viral Sarc gene in Rous sarcoma virus was shown to be derived from a normal cellular gene, and by a mechanism that I won't have time to talk about here, in which a gene that we recognize as inherently cellular because its coding region is divided into exons separated by introns, and a virus that has the capacity to replicate but lacks an oncogene has acquired the coding sequences by mechanisms we now mostly understand to generate a continuous coding sequence, the viral Sarc gene, with some significant differences from its cellular progenitor, so that it's possible to say that something about how the viral Sarc protein acts as a transforming protein. And this, like all good strategies or all provocative questions about science, produced answers that promoted another set of questions, and included among those questions is whether other retroviruses than Rous sarcoma virus carried other cell-derived oncogenes, and the answer to that was resoundingly yes. There are at least 20 to 30 novel genes that were identified long before the Human Genome Project came on the scene by studying these viruses. And the other important question is whether those oncogenes have a role in human cancer. And again, work done by a multitude of investigators showed that the answer to that question is clearly yes. And today, as I think many of you know, we have therapies that are employed in a branch of oncology called precision oncology that can block the actions of those activated genes and produce profound and prolonged remissions of human cancers that were previously untreatable. So this is a summary of how I think about axiom number 3. How do you make good discoveries? It's by making a deliberate calculation about what the problem is you're trying to understand, formulate the right questions, have available and make use of the right methods, produce the right interpretation of whatever you find, follow up the work with more questions and more good answers, and then apply the results ultimately to the betterment of human health. So let's take a simpler axiom, number 4. People think of science as being a cloistered activity in which people in white coats sit in a room by themselves and make discoveries. Well, that's not the way it works, and it's not the way science can be the most productive or the most fun. As you've heard, I established a partnership with Mike Bishop that lasted for many years. It's illustrated in some of these pictures. But we also were working with a large team of investigators, graduate students, postdocs, technicians, other helpers in the lab. And one example of a get-together is shown in the lower left over here. These folks, not necessarily doing experiments together, but forming a team of people working with similar techniques and engaging socially in a lively and pleasurable way, have a major influence on the environment in which work is done. And there's no doubt that work is generally accomplished with more pleasure and certainly and often with greater productivity by assembling a team of people who respect each other, treat each other well, and are all highly motivated to do exciting scientific work. Fifth axiom has to do with a sideline, what may be viewed by many people as a sideline to research, namely teaching. Many of us do our research in academic institutions, which by their very nature involve training of undergraduates, postdocs, medical students, graduate students. And it's common for people to say to themselves, well, I'm going to be evaluated by my research productivity, so why should I bother to do any teaching? And I'd make a strong argument that teaching is actually an essential and pleasurable and productive part of a life in science. That when you speak in front of a class of students, you are likely to recruit the best of those students into your own laboratory group, that you learn in much greater depth the history and the subtleties of your own field because you have to explain them to the students, that you, of course, are serving the institution that pays you, and you're serving the institution by helping the trainees become better scientists. Often, the kind of teaching that scientists do is carried out as part of a team effort in which courses are taught by a collection of individual investigators, and you learn a lot from your colleagues, from their teaching and from the cooperation that goes on as courses are constructed and then delivered. And finally, you expand your own intellectual horizons by being forced to read about topics that you might, in your busy efforts to do your own research, have ignored at your peril. So I personally have found that the expansion of those horizons is important. Most recently, I've been trying to compensate for my career as a teacher only among teams of investigators or teachers by teaching a course entirely on my own, initially at the City University of New York and its Honors College, and more recently at Columbia University. And this is a course which is rather different from what I do in my daily life, and that is to focus. It's a course that focuses on the interaction between science and society. We talk about how people choose to become scientists, why governments bother to pay for science, who owns the products of science, what is the role of patenting and licensing, what are the limits of science, why do people criticize it, what does science get wrong, what do we do when people commit misconduct during their scientific careers, how does science influence government policy of various kinds, ranging from the the governance of pandemic control to budgetary issues, and we take on issues that are even more peripheral to the day-to-day life of science by talking about how science is portrayed in the theater, in novels, in memoirs, and other places. So this has enlarged my universe quite a bit, and I use this example to commend to you when you become, or if you are now, independent investigators to take on teaching. My sixth axiom has to do with another way in which science engages society, and that is the way in which we treat the products of our work and make the products of that work accessible to the public. And I have come to believe extremely strongly that we have a responsibility to make our work accessible to others. We're being paid by the public or by philanthropic organizations that are responsible to the public, and we should be doing that as quickly and as freely as possible. And this is a phenomenon or an attitude that has existed for a long time, but the ability to achieve the desired result has been made much more profoundly possible by the internet. But even long ago, in, for example, 17th century Netherlands, a pathologist named Tulp used to gather his friends and neighbors into his laboratory and exhibit what he learned as a pathologist by dissecting human cadavers and showing people what science was revealing about human anatomy and physiology. And when you look at a picture like this by the famous Dutch artist Rembrandt, you begin to think, are we doing what needs to be done to make our work accessible to others? And part of changing the culture of science, to my mind, is to be sure that we're not monks sitting in our prestigious and expensive libraries, but instead we're putting our work into the public domain in a way that people do when citizens build a library like the New York Public Library and make the knowledge that human beings have created freely available to the citizens of, in this case, New York City. And over the course of the last almost 25 years, in various roles that I've had at the NIH and elsewhere, I've been trying to make the scientific literature more available to everybody. And I've been doing that in three ways that I just mentioned briefly. First, by building the equivalent of the New York Public Library of Science, so-called digital public libraries that operate over the internet, by one means or another, bringing into this digital public library the published work of medical scientists. And I began this by creating a full-text repository at the NIH called PubMed Central that contained much more than the PubMed that many of you are familiar with. PubMed contains just titles and authors and abstracts, but PubMed Central contains the full text of journal articles. Initially, all of these articles were placed in the public library, PubMed Central, only after a period of 6 months or to a year of delay, because journals could obviously not afford to continue to publish if no one would buy a subscription, and nobody would buy a subscription if everything was there free from the beginning. But with time, it became apparent that we needed to accelerate things even more dramatically by changing the business model by which publication occurs. And instead of having the process of publishing supported by subscriptions that would only allow the subscriber, one or a few individuals, to look at the journals, we advocated for a mechanism by which the journals would be supported instead by so-called authors' fees, in which the author, supported by a funding agency that was paying for the research, would spend a very small fraction of the research budget on publication fees. And these open access journals, exemplified by a publishing house that two colleagues and I founded in 2003, the Public Library of Science, or PLOS, was one of the first to produce very high quality open access publishing that provided the results of work by authors who were publishing in such journals immediately and completely to the public. A third development, which has been much more prominent in just the last few years, is to foster even more rapid access to the results of research by providing the research results even before formal peer review. And these so-called preprint servers were actually developed for biological science based on work that had been done a couple of decades before by physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists who had elected to provide their work to the public through public access, through these so-called preprint servers, with the idea of not only providing new ideas and new results to the public very quickly, but to solicit criticism from colleagues that would then be used to make the kinds of changes that commonly occur during peer review of manuscripts, so that ultimately they get published by traditional journals. So this is still a work in progress. I probably should mention that in the US, the Office of Science and Technology Policy has recently announced that by 2025, all science supported by any part of the US government must be immediately available through one means or another, either posting on PubMed Central or by open access publishing or by yet other devices at the time that the paper is officially accepted through peer review. This is a radical change, but it's in the spirit of other efforts, such as what's so-called Plan S, which began in Europe, that it has been developed by many major funders of research, private and government funders, who recognize that they have a responsibility to those who provide the funds for the research to be sure that the findings of the investigators supported by the funders are as quickly as possible delivered to the public, so that they have maximum impact on the science to come, and also gratify the expectations of those who have been funding the science. So I'd like to talk for the next two axioms about specific ways in which scientists need to recognize a relationship between science and society that should influence their activity. And sometimes takes people a long time to recognize this responsibility, and indeed, in my own case, it took a long time. When I was at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, in the early parts of my career, for the first 15 years or so, I would characterize myself as being obsessed with my science, unwilling to take on certain social responsibilities that I thought were not all that much fun. I didn't go to faculty senate meetings. I didn't take on any official role in my own department. I didn't join committees unless they concerned students. So I was, focused on my research and pretty oblivious to what many others were doing for the benefit of the Society of Scientists and the broader society as well. But as time went on, I began to appreciate the need to be a little more responsible, and I did that in various ways, sometimes in the public sector, for example, chairing a committee that named the AIDS virus the immunodeficiency virus. I worked on behalf of scientists who were trying to achieve greater funding for a study of AIDS. I worked with the NIH and with the scientific community on a number of issues that were perplexing the community in the early 90s, how the NIH supports work, the administrative and facilities costs that are required for science to proceed, how we judge and punish misconduct in science, how young investigators are funded, and many other things. Indeed, there were four of us, fairly prominent people at the University of California, San Francisco. They're shown here in this antique picture, in which on the left is Bruce Alberts, who became the president of the National Academy of Sciences for 12 years. Sitting down is Mike Bishop. I'm standing in the background in the middle. The two of us have recently won a Nobel Prize and our well-known and stellar colleague, Mark Kirshner, now at Harvard Medical School, shown here as well. And the four of us wrote a letter to President Clinton and Vice President Gore when they were elected president to recommend that they recognize the effects of very minor increases in the NIH budget on young investigators, and instead recognize the potential of biological sciences by increasing the budget of the NIH by 15% per year, something which actually happened just a few years later. We made many other recommendations as well to try to decrease some of the stresses that we saw in the biomedical research community. This got me yet further engaged in the question of how we as scientists should be interacting with those who govern scientific activity. And one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I'd moved from giving advice to trying to take action on some of that advice as the new director of NIH in the fall of 1993. My time at the NIH was spectacularly interesting. I was happy to be living in a fairly peaceful and relatively quiet political context in which Republicans and Democrats were actually working together, unlike what's happening in the U.S. political system today. And we had, I think all the sciences were feeling that under that administration that we were well treated and providing a good environment for doing things at the NIH that were very helpful to my ambitions for changing things at the NIH, including an environment that encouraged recruitment, construction of new buildings, expansion of programs. And I was director at a time when a lot of great things were happening. The Human Genome Project was accelerating. We were spending more money and paying more attention to global health. The digital public library that I mentioned, PubMed Central, was created. Certain fields of research were producing definite benefits for healthcare, such as targeted cancer drugs and effective treatments for elimination or for control of HIV. We created the Vaccine Research Center that you all know about because it was it's a place where many of the principles of the new vaccines against coronaviruses were developed. And we built a new clinical research center and developed clinical training programs that have been important. A couple of pictures show some of the most enjoyable moments of my time serving as the NIH director. On your left is a picture of the most famous scientist in the world today, Tony Fauci, with me. I'm the guy with the bald spot in the lower left, talking to Bill Clinton and Al Gore about retrovirus replication to try to convince them that we knew enough about viruses like HIV and others to help build better vaccines through the construction of a new vaccine research center, which was done in the course of just a couple of years. On your right is a picture of me sitting with Hillary Clinton at the State of the Union address in 1998 when Clinton was proposing dramatic increases in the NIH budget. So these were good moments. It wasn't all easy, but did show to me that engagement in public service on behalf of the scientific community was a good thing to do if you had aptitude and intention to do it. The eighth axiom is one that is a kind of a corollary of the idea of serving society, and that is to recognize that science is not free. It will never be free of politics. Science is a creation, in some ways a creation of politics, because you have to have governance, you have to have money, you have to have leadership, and science is at the service of society and vice versa. And that is a perception that goes back to the earliest days in U.S. history, when it was clear that the principles on which our government was founded had been outlined in the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, and many of the leaders of our country in those early days, even though they're all men, all white men, were still products of an enlightened society in which new liberal ideas were being fostered by a number of philosophers. One remarkable year in which the involvement of one of our leaders, Abraham Lincoln, was particularly clearly manifest was the year 1863, when Lincoln was enmeshed in the oversight of our Civil War, but he nevertheless found the time and saw the importance of founding a National Academy of Sciences, completing a transcontinental railroad with new manufacturing and scientific technologies, and established the so-called land-grant colleges to do agricultural science. To jump ahead about 80 years, during World War II, Vannevar Bush, who was a physicist at MIT, led Franklin Roosevelt's Office of Science Policy and oversaw the development of better radar, the atomic bomb, many other things that were products of science that influenced dramatically the outcome of the Second World War. As a result, Franklin Roosevelt recognized that we needed to have some kind of general science policy to govern the actions of the U.S. After the war ended. And he asked Vannevar Bush to write the essay that was mentioned in my introduction, Science, the Endless Frontier, which laid down a blueprint for how science should be conducted with government funding. And the fundamental idea, just to make this brief, is that Bush's view of the government's role in science was to support science at academic institutions and in government facilities to make basic discoveries about the fundamental features of nature, and to make the products of that work available to anyone, often people with commercial interests, to develop practical applications that were useful for society in the private sector. Other kinds of involvement by presidents are illustrated by a couple of additional pictures that I'll show you. One is of President Nixon signing the National Cancer Act, which dramatically increased the funding and the authorities for the cancer research program conducted by the government, influenced my own life in very important ways, because that bill was signed just about the time I entered cancer research. This is an example of how the president uses a council of advisors on science and technology, the so-called PCAST, which I co-chaired with a couple of colleagues in the early parts of the Obama administration, to get information about how the government should respond to pandemics such as influenza, a pandemic that we experienced in 2008 and 2009. And Obama was also heavily influential in developing precision medicine in our country by embracing the ideas that I talked about yesterday, that allows us to make more precise diagnoses and make use of some modern targeted therapies for cancer and other diseases. Axiom number 9 is perhaps somewhat self-evident to those of you in this room, but I want to be sure it's articulated. That is that science is inherently international, and yet we need to remember that there are political influences, exemplified by the passage of Brexit, which is isolating Britain from the rest of Europe, or right-wing nationalistic policies that are now evident in many countries, particularly evident in our country during the Trump administration. They provide true barriers to maintaining science as an international activity. And it's international at least two ways. Most of us, especially I think laboratories in the States, are heavily dependent on people from other countries. This is one snapshot of my own laboratory in the roughly 2005, when, as you can see from the labels, most people came from other countries, including Greece, Nicaragua, India, China, and others, and Taiwan. But there's another way in which science is inherently international through interactions of funding agencies and large groups. This is a picture taken in Dakar, Senegal, in 1997, when I and a colleague from the Pasteur Institute initiated an effort to provide special support for African scientists working in Africa on malaria. And that resulted in the creation of the Multilateral Initiative on Malaria, still an active organization with now over a couple of thousand African scientists working on malaria together. And it's also illustrated by the way the NIH has, and the US government more generally, has been active in a number of enterprises, the Uganda Cancer Institute, the creation of the PEPFAR program to treat and study HIV in many countries that can't afford to do certain things on their own, and in the pursuit of malaria as exemplified by the Malaria Research and Training Center in Bamako, Mali. And because of some recent threats to international relations in science, I need to emphasize the dangers posed by some new policies that were largely created by the Trump administration. Some of those policies dealing with procedures for issuance of visas and other immigration steps that are inhibitory to the arrival of new faculty and trainees from abroad, a feeling that relationships between countries are competitive and not cooperative, and to a certain extent, especially with respect to China, a kind of ethnocentric paranoia that is very worrisome and, as I believe now, deterring the willingness of Chinese young scientists to come to America for further training. The final point is simply one that I think needs to be embraced by everybody during a scientific career, that we are privileged to be in the front row of an enterprise that is making discoveries that inspire human beings and unite us, and teaches the message of what it means to be human, whether that comes from looking into outer space with telescopes more powerful than others, or whether it comes from looking inside us to understand the way in which our genetic instructions have evolved and are used to create living organisms. It doesn't matter. Science throughout a wide spectrum of activities is a remarkable way to learn in our brief times on this planet what it means to understand how life works and how the physical and chemical objects in our universe work together to provide an environment in which human beings have come to be. So if there's any single message from this list of axioms, that list is meant to remind you that scientific careers are complex. They are privileged, and they do confer pleasures, and they provide benefits to society. But they also come with real costs and with responsibilities that all of us need to take, I believe, need to take into consideration in thinking about how we spend our time in this remarkable enterprise. Happy to take some questions. Thank you for your attention.
Before we take questions, a few instructions, please. Please wait for the mic to reach you and speak into the mic clearly so that everybody can hear the question. Also, it would help if you raise your hand or stand up so that Professor Varmus knows where the question is coming from in the auditorium. Thank you.
been beaten into submission.
Excellent talk and scholarly presentation. My question is to you. When you were as an administrator, what one thing you wanted to do it and you could not do it, and still you want to do it?
Sorry.
So as an administrator at NIH, what one thing you wanted to do it but you could not do it, but still you want to do it?
Okay. Well, yeah, there were plenty of things that I wasn't able to get done, but I would say for any of you who have the ambition to become leaders of institutions, you start out with a set of aspirations. Don't let aspirations get pushed upon you. Start out by making a list of things. And I did make a list of things. I would say the one thing that was a disappointment to me then and remains a disappointment to me is the idea of recruiting into the scientific enterprise people who have traditionally not been part of it. So in America, that means, to a certain extent, women. Although that problem was solving itself without my having to interfere, because the number of women rising through the ranks in science had improved a lot. But where we've been very unsuccessful is recruiting people from underrepresented minority populations, especially Black Americans and Africans, Hispanics of various kinds, people who belong to so-called Native Americans, and this is a long-term problem. I've made an effort in the beginning when I was NIH director. 25 years later, it's still a major problem that all of us are trying to figure out ways to confront. There are inherent problems that are imposed by the risk of being a biomedical scientist, for example, and requiring the cushion of wealth that many white Americans have and Hispanic and Black Americans do not. So when opportunities are offered to these largely underrepresented minorities, they tend to go into medicine or law or business, and where careers are actually more secure, and efforts that we're always trying to develop and to implement for improving the representation of these groups in science is an ongoing challenge, and one that I didn't meet as NIH director. There are other examples too. There were plenty of failures, but it's more fun to talk about success.
Yes, I love the 10 commandments you showed us.
They're not commandments.
Sort of. I took the picture so that I can use it for teaching students. So thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.
And the question I have is, and often we debate that what are the sort of disruptive changes that India needs to make significant progress in science. You have been coming to India and you have seen the growth. And you would agree with us that we should have been somewhere else and not where we are right now. So in your opinion, it's easier for someone from outside to look at that you need to make these kind of changes to really, take the science to a different level. So I would like to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm not entirely sure where the question's going, but I think one thing that we all see as a challenge is how to get people with the right talents to work together to get projects done. And I've seen situations in which that has worked quite well. One example that I know is pretty familiar to many of you here is the way in which we've tried to bring disciplines together in the use of genomics to understand both human evolution and normal human function, but also diseases like cancer. And I particularly refer to the Cancer Genome Atlas that was overseen largely by the National Cancer Institute when I was there, to try to characterize the genetic abnormalities that might confer risk of cancer, and especially those abnormalities that occur during life to drive normal cells to become cancer cells. That effort required bringing together clinicians, pathologists, patients, molecular biologists, computational scientists, and in a very self-sacrificing way, because it was hard for any individual to get credit. The NCI got a lot of credit, but there were thousands of people spending a lot of time grading and analyzing large data sets to create at least a provisional map of the genetic abnormalities associated with 20 or so of the most common types of cancer. So I think that was an example of how, when you put your mind to it, you can bring people of diverse talents and interests together to serve the common good. It hasn't been so easy to do that for all things and to raise the money that's required to pull people from hospital settings and basic research labs and genome centers together to do a much wider survey of genomes and genomes from cancers. I've been involved through the New York Genome Center in a project called Polyethnic 1000 that is intended to study cancers in a wide variety of peoples, many of whom are not represented adequately in the TCGA and other current databases. But it has been a challenge to raise the kinds of funds that I think actually represent a really good investment in the future of cancer research, and to bring together people of many different disciplines and talents. So that's a place where we need new ideas to give the right kinds of rewards. Many of the tensions that I see in the biomedical research community these days are related to the way in which we evaluate each other. And we still deal with some pretty simplistic precepts. For example, we seem to favor the idea that people should be independent as opposed to members of scientific teams. That seems wrong-headed. We have the ability to say, I was a member of a team, I wasn't the first author, but I did the following thing to make this project work. Secondly, we place too much emphasis on where a paper is published instead of what the paper says. And it's all too common to hear that a graduate student or a postdoc feels they're at a disadvantage because they haven't published in so-called high-impact journals like Cell, Nature, Science, when in fact they published very good work in a specialty journal and have really great ideas. So we need to provide means for people to tell their evaluators what they've done. And I think those tools already exist, it's just a matter of employing them. So, for example, in places where I've had some authority, I've insisted that when promotion committees or appointment committees consider new members or promotion of old members of the faculty, that at least some people read a few of the papers that the candidate has written, that the candidates for appointment or promotion outline in a few paragraphs the contributions they made to their 3 or 4 or 5 most important works. People may publish hundreds of papers in their career, but usually only a few are really important, and it's not that hard for people to single out their major accomplishments and allow themselves to be evaluated not by their H score or some ridiculous computational indicator of reputation, but instead be evaluated by what they would consider to be their signal contributions to the growth of their field.
I would encourage the students and other young researchers to make the most of this opportunity.
It was a nice journey, sir, that you told. So my question is kind of personal question. So
Personal about me or about you?
no, personal about you. So my question is, means in your entire life of this long journey that you did in science and politics and research, so what thing that makes you excited or the one thing that you was addicted to that gives you that heavenly feeling other than research, science or politics, or that still you like to do? Your hobby or
Well, I love my wife.
That's a nice question. Answer.
I finally got a rise out of the crowd. I'll be home tomorrow. That'll be the first thing I'll tell my wife. She's been good to me.
Well, I have one rather more curiosity than question. Did your training in English literature have any impact in your scientific career?
No, it's very hard to know. This was not a controlled experiment, but it's given me pleasure in life, and being a student of literature has made me a better writer, as you probably have recognized. Scientists spend a lot of time writing and speaking, and having mastery of the language is useful. So I don't think it is more profound than that. I think there are plenty of people who do literature who would not choose to or be good at science. I think I've been fortunate in having some talent in both areas, but I do think there are relationships between reading literature and studying the natural world that sometimes go unappreciated. Some literary critics have tried to enforce the message that when you're reading literature in a serious, critical way, you should be not receiving the wisdom of others about the literature, but looking at the product itself. A famous critic in the 1920s, I.A. Richards, wrote a book called Practical Criticism, in which he asked the reader to focus on the poem itself. Forget about what Dr. Johnson said about this poem. Just look at the poem and see whether you think what you think the poet is trying to tell you, and how that is done. So it's a kind of scientific evidence-based enterprise that makes science and literary criticism look not that different. But I think in general, what I would say about my own experience with literature is that it was appealing to me, especially at the time, and it continues to bring me pleasure because I like to read widely, and I do think that attention to language, as I mentioned in my introduction of Michael Bishop to you, that those of us who care about language and how it's used to create either literature or great scientific papers can be a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
There's a lady behind.
So,
Hello? Yes, sir. So I was wondering, I've heard a lot about the reproducibility crisis that's currently ongoing in science. So I was wondering, could open access be a solution to that, or would there need to be other incentives for that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I too am concerned about the reproducibility crisis. I'm not sure that, I think open access, I don't think open access itself, open access really is a business proposal. It's a way of funding research in a way that allows it to be available to everybody. But I think the availability to everybody does open up an opportunity to help with any aspect of our evaluation of scientific work, because it exposes more people to the work. I do think that biologists in general have been more hesitant to express their criticism of their colleagues' work than is the case in other fields of science, particularly astrophysics, particle physics, and some other areas where, for some reason, scientists, at least in the US, have been accustomed to making polite, constructive criticism of work on preprint servers, for example. I mentioned that physicists developed preprint servers long ago. Actually, in 1991, my friend Paul Ginsberg, working at Los Alamos, built something called Archive, which all physicists and computer scientists used to post their results on. And in general, every article received criticism. Maybe because the community is smaller, maybe because the work is much less likely to be subject to patents and licensing and commercial interests. People just from the beginning thought that sharing their work on the internet was a fine thing to do, and making comments about your colleagues' work was considered to be constructive and not political or a mark of that might influence a relationship. So I would like to see us move in that direction. One very constructive thing that's happened in the States, and maybe in some other places as well, is a tendency to post the reviews. Now journals like eLife routinely will post the criticisms that are received, but during peer review, not just things that might be posted by somebody who's willing to make a comment. And I think that's a very useful step, because now the journal eLife has taken a more dramatic step and said that any article that we send out for review, as any essay that we send out for review, can be published regardless of whether the reviews are critical or not. That the authors are given a chance to respond to the criticisms, and but if the paper has been reviewed, the authors make a decision about whether or not to publish it. I think someone is really pretty foolish if they say, I'm going to publish my paper without any further changes, even though the reviewers have been highly critical of it, because the reviews are going to be published right next to the paper. So I'm hoping that that errors of all kinds, not just errors that result from sloppiness, but things that result from just a wrong idea or not having perceived the relationship of some other work to the work described in the article. I think that can all together reduce problems of replication. As you know, failures of replication can be due to a lot of things, and I think some of the things will be very difficult to sort out. As you probably know, there are now quite a few people, at least in the States, who are scrutinizing all articles for signs that the data may have been manipulated in some unethical way, and that's an enterprise which is causing a lot of difficulty at the moment, because even though we would like everything to be completely above board and honest, there are going to be careers that are placed in jeopardy by one person who manipulates data and doesn't reveal the manipulation to the other authors. So we're all feeling a little vulnerable to the possibility that papers and careers will be discredited by detectives who are looking to find evidence that work has been manipulated and may not be reproducible for those reasons. There's somebody in the middle there too. Okay, yeah. I see
you had mentioned something about by the time the delay in the independent career for a scientist. So what do you think will be a solution? Because once you become successful, you try to recruit more and more people to pursue your ideas, and these people eventually need to get some place to settle to start their own independent career. So there is always going to be more number of postdocs or trainees who are aspiring for an independent career, and there are not enough independent career positions available. Yeah. So what's your kind of thought process and solution for this?
I'm not a labor economist, but your question's a really good one, and we've all struggled with what to do. I think one thing that's happening in the States right now is that more and more people who've been trained in traditional academic institutions are going into the commercial sector. And while I don't think that was a particularly well-planned change in the demography of science, it's having a big effect. Many of my colleagues, and I too, are seeing fewer applications from American graduates because they're taking jobs in biotech companies and other places that in the commercial sector where careers are more stable, the work conditions are good, the science is interesting, some of the products that are being developed through the success in basic science combined with the money now available in the commercial sector is actually providing a pretty interesting environment in which to do science. So I think that's diminishing the competitiveness to a certain extent. I think the second issue is one related to an answer I gave over here about how you deal with evaluation, because one of the things that makes the competition particularly unpleasant is competition that's based on criteria that are not, in my view, responsible, and to feel that that you're not receiving the attention you deserve because you're being evaluated by what journal you publish in as opposed to the quality of your work is discouraging. The third thing I would say is that funders need to pay attention to what they're supporting and not simply accept the verdict of a review committee. I think review committees are being unduly influenced by the percentage of grants that get funded, and they're tending to support work that is not very adventurous. One of the things that I've been involved in through work with some of my senior colleagues is efforts to encourage funding agencies to specifically set up grant initiatives that are focused on young individuals who want to take on work that is not just original in nature, but different from what they've done during their training periods. I think one of the things that is making some work seem rather mundane, what we call risk averse, is the belief that you're more likely to get funded if you continue something that you've been doing successfully, something that seems highly likely to produce more results, and also work that seems to be close to the clinical interface, so-called translational work. And I'm a strong proponent of trying to create, not to try to change the whole enterprise, but to at least set aside some funds that are specifically for particularly talented young people who are moving into independent positions at a young age, are willing to take on new topics and do work that's truly original, not requiring a lot of preliminary data to substantiate their claims that they'll get results. All funders want their grantees to publish papers and get famous, but the fact is that funders too have to be involved in risk-taking, and not just the investigators. They have to say, we're going to devote a certain amount of our funding to projects that are very uncertain, but have a high likelihood of producing something really exciting if they work out. I think we all have a responsibility, if we agree with those precepts, to tell our colleagues about success that comes from pursuing strange things. I like telling my own story about working with a chicken virus that happens to cause a cancer in chickens that led in part to the revolution in cancer treatment. And there are many other stories, whether it's about CRISPR or about recombinant DNA technology or a lot of things. You know, people associate recombinant DNA technology with the biotech industry as though that industry produced the technology. Not true. All this came out of work being done with enzymes that cut DNA at specific sites that were studied by people who, some of whom won Nobel Prizes, some of whom later made a lot of money, but they're not public heroes. What people know about are Herceptin, things that came out of the biotech industry, and they think that industry somehow created all this technology. That's not the way it works. It worked the other way around. Technology was developed through fundamental discoveries, and if we don't invest in those discoveries, we're not going to have the next big wave of success in science, commercial or academic.
That just leads to another question or comment. So what do you, so about science education with respect to the history of science or these, so a lot of these misconceptions could be addressed by educating at the school or college level about the history of science. I don't know what is the level of that kind of information available for undergraduate or graduate students.
Well, the information is available. The problem is getting people's attention in a world that is full of social media and a lot of other things. So, we're all struggling, and I've heard from people in my tour of India this time, but we're all worried about vaccine deniers and people who are skeptical of science, and it's very hard to, when you give talks about the importance of science and try to educate people about science, in general, we call preach to the choir. You're preaching to people who already believe these things, and it's hard to get the attention of those who have animosity toward how science works or what it does. You can't force information on people, and I find that there are an awful lot of people these days who start with certain beliefs and are very difficult to move away from those beliefs.
Sir?
So I just want to ask your opinion on this preprints and like preprint reviews done by Review Commons, because I'm asking this because in many orthodox places it is not recognized as such that it's a good thing or should be seen for promotion. So like what are your views on this?
I think that people are getting educated about preprints, and one thing that really helped is one of the good things about the pandemic was that people learned that preprints were incredibly important. Word got out there quickly. Certainly the NIH now accepts a URL from a preprint server as a citable entity, as evidence that there is work that's been done and been reported. Remember that the history of publication of science doesn't include peer review. When Galileo was writing up his observations about the sky, he decided when he wanted to publish his work, and he wrote a book, and he sent it around. And we've let these often high profit-making organizations, the publishing houses, and I regret to say scientific societies, become dictators about what gets published. And it really should be the author's responsibility to say, I have this piece of work based on observations I've made in my laboratory, and I want other people to know about it, and then to decide how much criticism to subject the paper to. You show it to your friends, you show it to your co-authors, you show it to critics, your colleagues. You may post it on a preprint server and hope that there are people who write commentary. You send it to a journal and ask them for an opinion. But why shouldn't the author retain the right to say when they want the paper published? But it's hard to convince everybody to post their work, but I think the dramatic rise in the number of preprints during the pandemic has convinced a lot of folks that you're not going to get scooped by doing this. You actually, at least in the American system, you put a date stamp on that article by putting it in the public domain on a preprint server. So the intellectual property is protected if that's what you're worried about. And there are people who do worry about that, but their fears are misfounded.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great session that we had today. But I had one question. Speaking about open access, what are your views on Sci-Hub?
Well, I would rather do things without stealing material. And my view is that we can solve these problems through legitimate, lawful means. But I appreciate the revolutionary fervor, and I think that attempting to free the literature is fine, but one has to be realistic about the fact that publication has costs. Peer review has costs, has benefits, but has costs as well. Formatting, editing, these things have costs that have to be covered by somebody.
Good morning, sir. It was a great pleasure to be here today. A common question that every student must be having, that what was the one thing that kept you focused in your life to do the things you wanted to? And
I don't know how to answer that question, frankly. I don't think there was ever one thing I wanted to do.
Okay.
I want to do lots of things.
Do that 10 axioms motivated you?
Is what?
Do that 10 axioms that you made motivated you?
10? I don't understand what you said.
That 10 axioms which you...
Oh, 10 axioms. Oh, no. I don't think I recognized those until a couple of years ago when I'd began to think about how to give talks of this kind. But, you know, it doesn't mean that the axioms weren't there somewhere in my head.
Okay.
But, you know, it might be useful for you to do this exercise at an earlier age. But, you know, there was a time when I thought I should begin to think about what rules of behavior have guided me and what is important. And but you know, I think yes, some of the things I've said were unconsciously operating to make me do the things I've been doing. But I think you have to have some belief that science is a worthwhile thing and that you want to try to benefit it. And there's certain things that are simply required if you're going to have an enjoyable life in science. But formalizing these axioms is something that happened. I've been giving this lecture off and on for a few years, and the formula of thinking about axioms is something that seems to work. And so, but it's not that I didn't start the day when I was 30 years old by looking at my list of axioms to see which axioms I was going to follow that day.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Well, that's good, but we'll have to decide when we have to close down. Okay.
It was a nice talk. My question is, what are your views on the fact that there should be a better connection with respect to doctors, clinicians, industrial group and academic research for better medical advances and overall development of technology?
Yeah, I think everybody would agree that collaboration among people with different talents and skills is important in doing science. I think if I were writing a list of 20 axioms, there would have been an axiom about working with people from other disciplines, but you know, I just didn't have room for that one. But I agree that, in fact, I made that point in answer to another question, that yes, it's important to get people from different disciplines to work together. But one thing that I object to is the idea that we should fund research just because it's going to be interdisciplinary. You know, most research is interdisciplinary. I've seen a lot of NIH institutes waste money on efforts to ensure that engineers work with cell biologists, for example. Okay, it's fine to do that if you've got a scientific goal in mind, but just to put people in the same room is not enough for me to spend money.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. So my question is on.
Where are you?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So my question is on behalf of students who are applying for graduate positions. So during your time as a PI, what attributes did you look for in students?
What are the criteria I use for choosing?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I never take anybody into my lab without meeting with them. Now, in the last few years, I've had to meet them on Zoom, which is not as nice as meeting them in person. But what I look for is, first of all, likability. This is somebody I want to be friends with. Secondly, I look for ambition and intelligence, a good competitive spirit, and a genuine level of interest in good scientific questions and work that my own lab has done. So somebody coming to see me without having done a little bit of preparation to find out who I am and what I work on, that sends a signal that they're not that interested in me, and I'm not going to be attempting to recruit them. But I do think it's very important to try to understand people's social characteristics. One of the things that, I mean, this may seem unfair, but I've learned from experience that bringing unpleasant people into a lab, egotists, people without a sense of humor, those are events that poison a lab experience and a lab atmosphere, and I avoid that.
Sir, I'm feeling very proud talking and listening with you, sir. So, and with the Nobel work in your scientific career, what is the best approach for that? For person, institute, and country, we need to we need to pick the problem, scientific problem, which will provide the more impact on the society of health of the society, or we need to do the small part of the research and take the some learn the some things and acquire some knowledge and techniques, and then we will give chance to do the Nobel work, sir. Which one better approach, sir?
I really can't answer that question. I just think it's too complex. Yeah, a little bit of both. So I don't really have an answer to the question.
Thanks.
Too simple.
Hello, sir. So you mentioned the dissemination of science is important to masses. So whom do you dissemination of science and your ideas, scientific ideas, is important to masses are invented. So whom do you think should be the primary recipient of it in the society?
Somebody has to. I don't understand the question.
Yeah.
Shamila. Sharing science. Yes.
Yes.
I can't say. You put the thing on the internet, anybody can access it. But I think it's important to remember that putting science into the public domain through a device like PubMed Central or just or some other open library or preprint server doesn't just serve other scientists. That at least in the U.S. right now, there are a lot of other people interested in this stuff who wouldn't have access to it. So it's not as though, some people say, what's the big deal? Everybody at my university has access to the literature through the university digital library. But the fact is that their teachers, their patients, their patient advocates and family members, there are people in politics who have to make decisions about funding. There are educators, there are people who simply have an interest in science. And then there are citizens who say, even if I can't really understand it, I should have access to it because I paid for it. So there are a lot of potential readers out there, and I think we have a responsibility to say, it may just be one person reading my paper, it may be thousands. Nevertheless, I would like to be sure that my work is accessible. And it would be foolish to say that if we didn't have a way to do it. And before the internet came along, it would have been very hard to say everybody can have access to my work. And now we can do it. So we're scientists, let's do it.
Okay, I think one last question, yeah. Oh.
Hello, sir. Your talk was very nice. Thank you for the wonderful talk. My question is that you first were, in your early life, you were a literature student. You were a literature student in your early life. So what made you change your career? What was that one thing that motivated you to change your career?
It wasn't one thing.
Yeah, and also be so dedicated that you came so long to win till you won the Nobel Prize. And you also were so dedicated to this career, like you didn't think of leaving this career, like once you changed from literature to science, you are so dedicated in that. And what will you suggest to new researchers like us to be constantly motivated in what we are doing, because we face so many failures in our experiments?
Yeah. Well, I don't know how to deal with motivation. Experiments fail. That happened to me when I was working at the bench all the time. If you really care about what you're doing, you'll go back and maybe you have to change what you're doing, talk to your mentor, figure out what's wrong. But I don't know how to solve the motivation problem.
I mean, what motivated you to change literature?
Yeah, so that's very complicated. But I did write a book, a memoir that was mentioned by my interview, introduction, and that book is available for free online. You can have a look at that. But fundamentally, I just began to feel that I would be neglecting part of my talent by going in by sticking with literature and not going into medicine. I wasn't actually thinking so much about science then. I was thinking about medicine, and I thought as a doctor I would read and write, and I'd keep up my literary interests. The other way around wasn't true. After a year of graduate school, I turned around and, not knowing where it would lead, it was conceivable that I would have disappointed some other people, like my parents, by then dropping out of medical school. But I liked it, so I stuck with it. So there are a lot of human and cultural factors that I talk about in my memoir about it, but it's and influences of the history of other people who said medicine opens all doors. Certainly a graduate degree in literature doesn't open all doors, at least not as many doors as medicine might. And if you look at the careers of people who have become physicians, they end up as in a wide diversity of professions. Some of them end up as writers, and some of them end up as politicians, and some end up as scientists. So it does tend to open all doors to get a medical degree. In this sense, it allows you to prolong adolescence, which is now one of the axioms, but keeping opportunities open and not getting yourself fixed into a very narrow career pathway at an early stage is one of the messages I'd like to leave you with.
Sir, what would be your suggestion for students to develop the habit or art of asking the right questions?
Of what?
Asking the right questions, the art of asking the right questions. What would be your suggestions to develop?
I don't think I can outline how to do that. I've given you my axioms, and that, as I tried to say at the beginning, the principles by which you live, the practices you undertake, those are for you to decide. This is what I've done.
Okay, we'll close the Q&A session. You can interact with him over tea outside later. Okay.
Thank you all. Good questions.
Can you please stay back a few minutes and just
I'm sure. In your hands. Someone get the plug out for me.
Sure.
Oh, it's just right there. I thought it was on the other side. Do you have my connector? No.
Oh.
You. Thank you. That's mine.
For a few minutes. We are not done yet.
I thought I was done.
Yes. Okay, so we are very grateful to Professor Varmus for spending time with us here today. As a token of our appreciation, I request Dr. Arvind Sahu to please present him with a small gift. If you can just step to the center, that would be great.
Thank you.
We'll get it to you later. We can bring this to you later. Once again, it is my pleasure to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of everybody, especially NCCS. So, of course, I would like to begin by thanking Professor Varmus for spending 2 days with us. We have kept him on his toes ever since he arrived late evening on Sunday with multiple meetings with our faculty, our students, 2 talks, etc. So, we literally planned several events back to back. And thank you, Professor Varmus, for fully participating so enthusiastically in everything that we have planned for you. Your enthusiasm is very inspiring indeed. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank the Indian Academy of Sciences, Bangalore, for bringing Professor Varmus to India as Raman Chair 2020 and giving us an opportunity to host him at Pune. We are grateful that our colleagues and friends from other organizations and departments of the university joined us here today. And we are also thankful to all those who have joined online. I'm sure you've taken back valuable pearls of wisdom from today's talk. Last but not the least, thank you everyone, all the NCCS teams who have been working in the background quite hard to make all the talks and events happen. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here today. There is tea organized outside. Please do join in. One more, yes, an announcement that we had a panel discussion planned at 1:30 today. That has been cancelled due to unforeseeable reasons. So please make a note of that. Yeah. Thank you so much.